Stats that in India, almost 50% of the deaths before 70 are in people because of heart disease, whereas in Western world it's about 25%.
Heart attack
Die from cardiovascular disease.
There is a rise in heart attacks.
Often because it seems to be really likely to cause diabetes, which is where your blood sugars are too high, and that in turn can thicken up the arteries around the heart. So what we're talking about is the kind of measurement around your waist, the little pot belly that your uncle might have, or your 47-year-old cousin might have. That seems to be really strongly correlated with the chance of having heart disease.
You look through your family,
Right.
You're going to have some heart disease somewhere in your family. And if you look at the age that the youngest person in your family had heart disease and then work 10 years back from that, maybe that's a good time to really start thinking about heart disease and that doesn't happen on one day magically. That is a process that builds up over time, over years.
If you're worried about heart disease and you're Indian, or if you're anyone, basic risk factors which everybody in medicine knows are blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes.
Welcome to Delhi Belly, a series of conversations around preventative health, tailored specifically for people of Indian origin. I'm Nikhil Ahluwalia, a cardiologist and a researcher focusing on cardiovascular disease.
And I'm Abhishek Joshi, I'm a consultant cardiologist working in London.
Great, and today we're going to be focusing on one of the biggest topics around when it comes to preventative health, and that's heart disease. The reason we've decided to focus on this area is because not all risk factors are the same in all people. In our clinical practice in the UK, there is certainly a number of people who come in of Indian origin with heart disease, and managing them all in exactly the same way as we manage Caucasians is important, but then also taking into consideration that there are additional or other risk factors that need to be thought about with Indians.
All right, so why are we doing it and not someone in India, Nikhil?
Well, I think someone in India should be doing it as well, but we have spent decades between us researching into cardiovascular disease and trying to understand why it happens. And the title of cardiovascular disease is really broad.
Yeah.
It looks at heart failure, heart rhythm problems, heart artery problems, and inherited heart problems. But living in the UK, we're lucky to have a lot of research going on around us. And in the UK, we have a large number of Caucasian people, the white people who are participating in these studies, but an increasingly large number of Indians also getting involved. And so we do have some data that is teasing apart the differences.
I think that's right. I think even though the people we're talking about are on another continent primarily, a lot of the data and the insights, unfortunately, are coming from the UK at the moment. And we're right at the edge of researching those and looking into them. So that's why I agreed with you that we might be the right people to at least start this off. I'd love to hear from colleagues in India on their opinion on the sorts of things we're going to say on this podcast.
And I think the elephant in the room is we're both Indian origin. And so we have a vested interest in trying to understand the differences in our cardiovascular risk versus Caucasians. And we have families all around the world, really. But I'm getting an increasingly large number of messages and phone calls from family members in India who are having heart problems, are worried about heart problems and seeing doctors. And so I think for me, this is helpful in trying to straighten out how we should be managing these conditions and whether there are any real differences that they should be having in the healthcare they receive versus what we deliver here.
Sure.
So I'm going to give you a scenario, Abhishek. Your cousin, who's a 47-year-old, he suddenly collapses at work. He's taken into his hospital locally and he's had a heart attack. He stays in there for a few days. He started on a load of medicines. And he's half the man that he was when he comes out.
Poor guy.
Yeah, and you are looking at him and thinking, God, I'm 37. I'm fit. I think I'm quite well. I don't have any problems, don't have any heart problems.
Yeah.
But I've got a young family. I've got increasing amounts of responsibility. And what if I'm next?
Yeah.
I'm sure that's a thought that's gone through most people when they have a family member who's had heart disease because it's so common. We all know someone. What should we be thinking in those scenarios, and what can we do to try and reduce our heart risk?
Well, I like your scenario. I wish I was 37. It'd be lovely. And obviously, it's really sad when a member of the family has an illness. Heart disease is obviously super common. 1/3 of people are going to get it in their lifetime. And so it's not unusual to see someone else in your family have it. But frequently in my practice, I see heart disease that runs in families. Your father's got it, your brother's got it, and now your cousin's got it, and now you're wondering whether you're going to get it or not. So the question you're asking me, I think, and that we're going to talk about over the next few minutes, is how to identify the likelihood of me getting this, and also what should I do about it to prevent it from happening to me? And that's kind of right in our wheelhouse as cardiologists, right? Like, as well as treating the disease, we're also trying to avoid people from getting it in the future. So I would say the first thing to think about is your own medical risk factors for having heart disease. The top of the list is, are you a smoker? And if you're smoking, you should stop. It pretty much guarantees heart disease or increases the likelihood of you getting it soon significantly. Then we start looking at stuff that doctors measure, so blood pressure, cholesterol, whether you've got diabetes. And then there are some things you can't do much about, but that make it more likely that you're going to get heart disease over other people, and also make it more likely that Indians get heart disease over Western populations. So that's stuff like your genetics, your family history, your lifestyle and diet, which you can do something about, but you may have grown up with. So those are the things I'd stop and think about as somebody who thought they might have heart disease in the future. I'd start looking at those things individually and seeing whether I could improve them.
Great. I think the big scary thing for me as an Indian person is that Indians get heart disease earlier.
Right.
So usually it's 5 to 10 years earlier in life. And so whereas a person in the Western world might well get heart disease in their 60s, for an Indian person, it may be in their 50s or even 40s. And that's really your productive age when you're trying to build yourself up, trying to do things, trying to look after your family. And I read some crazy stats that in India, almost 50% of the deaths before 70 are in people because of heart disease, whereas in Western world, it's about 25%.
Right. Really interesting. So the stat I gave you, that a third of people are going to get it or is going to cause their deaths, which is really sad. That's clearly Western data, right? I said 30%. You're telling me that in India, it's up to 50% of deaths before the age of 70 due to heart disease.
Yeah.
Wow. And it happens 10 years earlier. So what that means, as you said, is they're in their kind of economically productive times, the time when you're earning money to feed your kids and to provide their education and to build your home. In the West, it often happens after retirement. So I guess 47, it feels really young in the UK for someone to be having a heart attack, but maybe in India that's quite common. Maybe in the Indian populations that we're seeing, certainly in my clinic, it does seem to be people who are maybe in their mid to late 40s. I mean, it feels really early, and it does appear to be based on ethnicity. That must really impact India, right? And the Indian economy. Does that have an effect on like people's livelihoods there?
Well, it goes more broadly than that, because even in the UK, we've got some really large registries like the Biobank in the UK, and that's got data from almost 500,000 people. And we know that Indians in that registry have twice the risk of having heart disease than an equivalent person who's white. So it's not just people in India, it's people of Indian origin who've moved across the world. And so that goes back to this question of, is it nature, is it nurture? There certainly seems to be something about being Indian that puts you at this higher risk of having earlier, more aggressive heart disease.
Yeah, and we're probably going to talk about the UK Biobank a lot over the course of this series, right? Because it's an amazing source of data. It's worth pointing out that that's lots of volunteers who are being followed up from a medical perspective in the UK with genetics and other measurements. I didn't know that they'd found that Indians had twice the risk of heart disease in that population. Were there a lot of Indians in it? Or, I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the limitations of all the data we've got at the moment. The number of Indians in the UK Biobank is relatively small, only a few percent. And so we really need more dedicated studies of Indians and our risk and how we can do things to try and mitigate this earlier risk factor. And that's happening. There are some really large studies going on around the world, even ones being conducted in India to try and understand this in a bit more detail. So it's good to see that there are things being done. But I still want to drill down to this point to try and understand why. Yeah. What is it about being Indian that puts you at a higher risk of having a heart attack earlier?
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about those risks that I talked about before, right? So we said kind of just generally being Indian appears to increase the risk.
Yeah.
But a lot of that can be measured, right? So there are bits about the Indian body, about the Indian physiology, the way that the chemistry works in Indian bodies that are different, we think, to kind of Western or other global populations, right? So there's something about the central adiposity, that kind of big tummy bit. In fact, the delly belly that we're talking about now, right? That seems to increase risk. So what we're talking about is the kind of measurement around your waist, the little pot belly that your uncle might have or your 47-year-old cousin might have. That seems to be really strongly correlated with the chance of having heart disease.
Okay.
Often because it seems to be really likely to cause diabetes, which is where your blood sugars are too high. And that in turn can thicken up the arteries around the heart. So now we're kind of drilling down into what gives people heart attacks, which is what our cousin had earlier on, right?
So you're saying not all risk factors are the same in the different types of people. So in Indians, things like having more fat around their tummy, having diabetes, puts you at a higher risk than those same features in a white person.
Yeah, I think there are some features of the Indian physiology that there is some evidence shows
Yeah.
that they just give you a little bit more risk than if you saw it in another population. You've got to take a little bit more concern about it. You've got to keep a closer eye on those things.
Yeah.
But I would also say that just the fact that our age appears to give us a heart attack, or our ethnicity gives us a heart attack nearly a decade earlier, means that all the things that people do in healthcare systems to avoid those things also probably need to happen a little bit earlier for Indians.
Okay.
So that 47-year-old cousin who's had a heart attack in the UK, he would have had his usual heart health testing about the age of 40. That's when the National Health Service in England offers screening for heart disease risk, blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes.
At the age of 40?
At the age of 40.
Okay.
But I think there's probably a strong argument, and it's not part of how we practice medicine in this country, but if you're Indian, you may want to think about getting those things measured at an earlier age, because it seems like heart disease happens to us at an earlier age. And of course, this person who's talking to us, their cousin, has had a heart attack recently. It's on their mind. So those are the sorts of things we might get checked out. Should we go through the list of them, right?
What
So,
sort of age?
exactly.
What sort of age should you be thinking about this then?
Well, so I think there's a lot of data to say if you start 5 years earlier at 35,
Okay.
you might catch more heart disease in particular populations, and that might also extend to Indians. So by that, I mean, get your cholesterol checked,
Mm-hmm.
get your blood pressure checked, check if you've got diabetes, make sure you're doing the recommended amount of exercise if you can,
Yeah.
and check that you don't have central obesity, that deli belly, that kind of weight around your waist. And then there are some other risk factors that we might talk about if we kind of get onto a bit more detail later on.
Yeah.
But you came up with a really good rule of thumb, right? That's not based on any evidence, but I really liked it when we were talking about this earlier on.
I was looking through some of the data from the UK and the USA, and it does look like heart disease happens earlier in Indian people. And so I think one easy rule of thumb that I would stick to is if you look through your family,
Right.
you're going to have some heart disease somewhere in your family. And if you look at the age that the youngest person in your family had heart disease and then work 10 years back
Nice.
from that,
Nice.
maybe that's a good time to really start thinking about heart disease, because heart disease, in a lot of cases, we're talking about heart attacks, and that's a furring up of the blood vessels around the heart. And that doesn't happen on one day magically. That is a process that builds up over time, over years.
Yep.
And so trying to catch that and treat that earlier is the goal, I think, for many of us.
Yeah, I love it. So what we're thinking about here, what you're talking about is this thing called atherosclerosis, right? The thickening of the heart arteries, and also other arteries, which can lead to heart attacks and strokes. But you're totally correct. It's got a decades-long lead-in time. You've got decades that you could do something about it, but you have to start doing it. And you can certainly reduce the risk of heart attack over those decades, almost reduce the risk down to zero, or close to zero if you want, through really, really good medical and social kind of physical activities and medication cares.
Fine. So it sounds like there are things we can do. It sounds like for people of Indian origin, trying to get on top of those earlier and perhaps being more aggressive about those things like managing your blood pressure, cholesterol, and diabetes risk earlier is a good thing. I read a great study from Canada, actually, which looked at people from 50 different countries.
Wow.
And it said those risk factors apply to everyone in the world. But for people from Indian origin, they also need to be looking at their waist circumference, so how much fat they've got around their tummy, their belly belly, and also their stress levels.
Oh, right.
And also their risk of diabetes, because diabetes affects Indians more aggressively in terms of their risk than
So if you have
others.
diabetes and that's going to cause heart disease by causing the arteries to fur up, it's going to do that to a greater extent if you're Indian than if you're from a Western population. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. That's what the evidence is showing to us. And again, this is the stuff which I hope will get teased out more in these large studies happening around the world.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really what we need to try and get on top of at an earlier age.
Cool. I guess we'll get on to talking about some of those risk factors over the course of the next few conversations that we have. I'm interested in stress. That's going to be an interesting one to pick apart. Keep an eye out for that, I think, if you're staying tuned. Okay, so I guess we've kind of identified what we ought to be looking at, right? If you're worried about heart disease and you're Indian, or if you're anyone, really, you want to know your risk of arterial thickening and subsequently those arterial thickenings blocking off and causing you a heart attack. And the basic risk factors, which everybody in medicine knows, but hopefully our audience can also catch up with us now and consider for themselves, are blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, and smoking. And then the things they can't do anything about, but we're going to be talking about a lot over the coming podcasts, are their ethnicity or their country of origin, because Indians seem to get it worse, almost twice as much, you're saying.
Yeah.
And then, of course, age and gender, which are things that you're kind of, or sex, you're kind of born with. But being a man and being older increases your chance of having a heart attack. So modifying the things you can modify, doing the exercise you need to do to get your blood pressure down, avoid diabetes by gaining weight, keeping control of your cholesterol, and then taking the medications if your doctor suggests that they're of value to you. We'll talk a lot about what medications might be valuable to you over the coming podcasts. sounds like we've got a plan for how to at least reassure yourself you're doing what you could do to avoid heart disease in the future.
Great. Looking forward to digging into all of that.
Amazing.
Great. See you next time.
Thanks a lot.